Mostly dry in the south, more wind and rain on the way for the north. How long will we keep this north to south weather contrast? Will high pressure build more widely, or will things remain as they are through the weekend and into next week? And what about temperature? Is that going up or is it going down? Any sign of any snowfall? I'll be answering those questions plus much more in this week's deep dive. Hello, I'm Met Office meteorologist Aidan McGivern. And before I get started, if you're watching this and you enjoy these in-depth explorations of the UK weather and global weather and the factors involved, please do hit the subscribe button on YouTube. These special weather forecasts are exclusive to YouTube, so if you don't want to miss out, do follow us to find much more, including the week ahead and the 10-day trend forecast that we do on a weekly basis, of course. And if you subscribe, then it will help to justify us doing many more of these in the future. But let's take a look right now at the view from space. This is the satellite imagery from earlier today, and you can see this beautiful swirl near Iceland. Stormy conditions for Iceland itself with a deep area of low pressure, but we're also affected by this low, even if it is relatively far away from the UK. You can see the swirl extending a weather front across the UK. That brought a spell of rain across many parts of the country overnight, but as it's pushed south, well, it's weakened considerably. We've not seen much rain at all as it's pushed into southern parts of the UK. And so really what we're looking at for the rest of the afternoon is for skies to brighten across southern parts of the country. This is the latest radar imagery, and you can see very little rainfall really during Monday and into Tuesday across southern parts of the UK. This is the weather front I mentioned. That's spread southwards. A spell of moderate to heavy rain across Scotland, Northern Ireland, into northern England, Wales overnight. But you can see it petering away there as it's pushed southwards. And very little rainfall on it at all, and that's all clearing south anyway. But what we're also seeing is a return to very showery conditions. If I fast forward there to the end, very showery conditions across the northern half of the UK. Now, these heavy showers and longer spells of rain, they're coming through in the colder airflow coming in from the northwest around that area of low pressure. And so what we're expecting actually over the next 24 hours or so is for some of these showers to be of a wintry nature over the hilltops of Scotland. And, well, for much of England and Wales to stay largely dry, closer to the area of high pressure. Not many showers for parts of Northern Ireland and into northern England. Most of the showers are across the central belt, northwards over Scotland. And so during the rest of Tuesday, these showers will be packing in. A lot of showers, especially for western areas. Drier for eastern parts of Aberdeenshire, eastern parts of Angus, but even here, the odd fleeting shower. They're carried through on a brisk wind, and they're falling as rain and hail at lower levels with snow above around 400-500 metres or so, but really only settling above 500 or 600 metres. So over the very highest routes of Scotland, perhaps an issue, but for most it's heavy rain showers, some hail and so on. A very blustery afternoon, and in fact it's windy across the UK. That wind is coming in from the northwest, and that's why it is going to feel cold out there. Now, these are the actual temperatures here. We're looking at 4 or 5 Celsius for Tuesday afternoon, 9 to 10 or 11 Celsius further south, perhaps the odd spot getting 12 Celsius. But when you add on that cold wind, these are the feels-like temperatures close to freezing across Scotland, if not a few degrees below freezing for the far northwest, and not far below what we're seeing across southern areas, so 8 or 9 Celsius, where the wind isn't quite so strong. So feeling cold in the wind, and that wind, of course, is going to pick up later on in the day. What we're seeing, the low pressure I mentioned near Iceland, what we're seeing is for that low pressure to start to approach the UK. So here it is for Tuesday afternoon. It's then carried by the jet stream. That's the position of the jet stream at the moment, lying in a straight line across the Atlantic, pushing in from the northwest into the UK. And here comes that low, tightly packed isobars on Tuesday evening and overnight, swinging its strongest winds and its heaviest showers into northern Scotland and fairly widely across northern Scotland. Gale force winds, wind gusts of 60 miles an hour, but in some spots even higher than that. And that's why there is a warning in force. So let's take a look at the wind gusts for starters. The winds are going to, well, it's a blustery afternoon for all of us with gusts of 50 miles an hour or so across northern England and parts of Scotland. But those winds are going to continue to pick up through the rest of the day. Here's the swathe of very strong winds coming in from the northwest, the low pressure centre just up there to the northwest of the UK. And then it's really through the evening from around 8 p.m. that we're going to see widely gusts of 50, 60 miles an hour across northern parts of Scotland, especially into the coastal part of the North Mainland, Lewis, into Orkney as well. And in some spots, 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts are possible. So wind disruption in places overnight. But of course, this is a part of the world where we are relatively resilient to wind gusts of this nature. So it's a yellow warning, a warning that we're going to see some gale force winds developing overnight, 60 miles an hour widely within this warning area, and in places 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts. In fact, we can take a look at the wind over the next 24 hours in a bit more detail using a graph that couldn't get to work last week. So I'm very excited to hopefully get it to work this week. And basically, if we click on the wind gust there, I can run my pen across the map. And let's start in the south to show you a bit of context here. So these are the kinds of wind gusts over the next 24 hours. This is the rest of Tuesday, and then into Wednesday, the wind gust on the left here. And for southern areas, we're looking at 30 mile per hour wind gusts typically. But if I run this pen a bit further north, you can see those wind gusts are increasing, particularly over the Pennines. That's where the wind's going to be bouncing over the hills. 40 to 50 mile per hour wind gusts during Tuesday and into Wednesday. So blustery over northern England and just to the east of the Pennines there as well. And for Northern Ireland as well, 30 to 40 mile per hour wind gusts typically over the next 24 to 36 hours. But the further north you go, and again, you can see this north-south contrast in the winds. The strongest of the winds are heading north and the lighter winds are further south. And really, it's as we get into central and northern Scotland, you can see those wind gusts increasing up to 40 to 50 miles an hour. But it's across the North Mainland there. It's close to 60, exposed parts of Lewis there, 60 mile per hour wind gusts. But Orkney, around Orkney, 70, perhaps approaching 80 mile per hour wind gusts in some of the most exposed spots. But a rapid decline there through Wednesday. So you can see that's 9 a.m. Still very windy as we start off Wednesday, but those winds decreasing so that by Wednesday night, it's certainly looking calmer out there. But the next few days after that very windy spell, the winds shouldn't be so much of an issue. However, we keep that north to south contrast in the weather across the UK. And so this is how it's looking with a bigger picture. We've got the jet stream running in from the Atlantic over the next few days, and just fast forwarding it there a little bit, and you can see really we've got another series of weather fronts coming in. This is Wednesday. Here's the low pressure that brings the very strong winds across northern Scotland on Wednesday. That pulls away into the North Sea. We've got further showers to come across Scotland on Wednesday. At first, the showers also ease as that low pulls away. And then, let's turn off the jet stream to make things clearer, a warm front starts to push in. Now that will bring a spell of rain, showery rain for Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, parts of northern England, perhaps North Wales on Wednesday. Then it will spread across Scotland and it will bring a spell of wet weather. So certainly on Wednesday night and into Thursday, we'll see this persistent rain spread into Scotland again. Wettest weather over western parts of Scotland, some damp conditions extending into northern England, parts of Wales, Northern Ireland as well. But really the heavier and more persistent rain is going to be across western Scotland because we've got this westerly airflow pushing a lot of moisture in to western Scotland and dumping a lot of that moisture in over the hills. Further south, we've still got this high pressure. So really that trend continues for the rest of the week. We've got drier conditions. In fact, some parts of southern UK will be mostly dry towards the south, whilst we'll see bands of rain, these weather fronts just continue to bring soggy conditions to Scotland in particular. These bands of rain are crossing the country during Thursday, and into Friday it will stay fairly damp across northwestern parts of the UK in particular. Some bits and pieces of showers further south, because actually it's going to be generally cloudy. What we've got here by this stage is a warm sector. More on that in a moment, but within this warm sector, that's the zone between a warm front and a cold front, we've got a lot of cloud. So actually, although it's quite bright on Tuesday in the south and into Wednesday, there'll be some brightness out there. It is increasingly cloudy, even if it is staying mostly dry further south. And certainly a lot of that cloud is going to be low towards the northwest, covering the hills and so on. So we've got this moist, warm sector, and that will have an impact on temperatures. More on that in a moment. But also it will bring a lot of rainfall into western Scotland. So, and that continues as we go into Friday. A bit more showery, a bit brighter for a time as this cold front clears through, and then later Friday, the next warm front comes along. So a repetitive pattern, these fronts dancing across parts of northern UK, southern areas closer to high pressure, so mostly dry. Now, speaking of mostly dry weather, a real contrast on the other side of the world, when you look at New Zealand. You may have heard about the extraordinary weather that we've seen in New Zealand. And I'll show you some stats in just a second. But unfortunately, there is more wet weather on the way over the next few days. Now, this is the rest of Tuesday, and what we're seeing is a tropical plume of moisture feeding into parts of the North Island, in particular Northland, in the far north there, and Auckland. These heavy bands of rain and thunderstorms carried by this plume of tropical moisture that will continue during the rest of Tuesday, Wednesday, and into Thursday before eventually higher pressure will build. And what we're expecting in Northland, now the Met Service in New Zealand have issued red warnings for Northland because of the rain. What we're expecting is another 1 to 150 millimetres of rainfall, and the typical average for this region is 75 millimetres for January. So another 100 to 150 millimetres of rainfall could cause further flooding on top of what they've already seen. And it's really quite extraordinary what they've already seen. I'll just show you a tweet from Niwa in New Zealand, and some incredible stats. So far, this was up to the weekend, 769% of their January monthly rainfall. That's 38% of their entire annual rainfall. Bearing in mind it's the middle of summer in New Zealand. It's just extraordinary amounts of rainfall, and a lot of that has fallen in Auckland. Some huge impacts in Auckland. You might have seen some of the video footage of flooded streets and buses floating and flooded supermarkets and so on. So unfortunately, even more rainfall to come over the next few days before eventually, hopefully, things do dry out later this week. But back to the northern hemisphere, and actually things are looking also fairly interesting on the other side of the Atlantic. What we've got here is a remarkable temperature difference across the United States at the moment, and that temperature difference could lead to some freezing rain and some sleet in places. What we're seeing really at the start of this forecast period is very cold air digging in across parts of Texas into Oklahoma, and that cold air is mixing with an area of rainfall, and it's within this zone across parts of Texas, Tennessee and Mississippi where there's the risk of freezing rain and some sleet, and in some places ice accumulations up to ½ an inch. So that's the sort of thing that can cause real issues. Now, as well as that, if we fast forward to later in the week, take a look at this. Some extraordinarily cold air heading into northeastern parts of the US. So that's something to keep an eye on for later this week and into the weekend. It's going to turn very, very, very cold. This pool of extremely cold air heading into northeastern parts of the US and eastern parts of Canada. All the while, why is that important to us? Well, it's interesting for one, but another thing that it's helping to do is to fire up the jet stream and perhaps make it more amplified, so that the next few days the jet stream develops an area of low pressure out to the west of the UK, And this area of low pressure coming out here, well, that's going to help to amplify the whole pattern. What I mean by that is that at the moment the jet stream's in a relatively flat position, and later this week, with that low pushing a lot of energy up towards Iceland, then we'll see as these weather fronts just push south across the UK and then push north again. And you can see this amplification in the weather pattern. Eventually, higher pressure will build across the UK as the jet stream, just fast forward a little bit there, you can see that amplification there. The jet stream pushes north, and so that by later Friday, warm front crosses the UK, spell of rain, and then higher pressure starts to build. There'll still be some changeable weather across northern parts of the UK. There'll still be weather fronts like this cold front that comes along really as we head into Saturday. That cold front for the start of Saturday crosses Scotland to bring a spell of rain and wind again. As it sinks south, it meets this area of high pressure, so it weakens and it then sits across southern parts of the UK or thereabouts for later Saturday. Clears the skies to sunnier conditions across the northern half of the UK for Saturday itself, but it also weakens considerably as it clears southwards. And we'll just see an area of cloud really later Saturday as that cold front comes south. But watch the high pressure, the amplified jet stream, that building high, both mean that things will turn more widely settled with lighter winds for later in the weekend as that high pressure builds in. But still, it's centred towards the south, and so still it's going to be having a big impact on keeping things relatively settled in the south, a bit more changeable further north. And that's really how we're looking as we go into Sunday with that high pressure across southern parts of the UK. Still a westerly airflow, warm fronts and mild air. In fact, speaking of mild air, it's looking like it is going to be a relatively mild weekend and a relatively mild end to the week as well, actually. Rewinding the clock there, I mentioned that warm sector. And it's really through Wednesday as the first weather front, the first warm front goes through. And then a couple of cold fronts and warm fronts continue to push across northern parts of the UK, never quite reaching the south, and if they do, they're going to be weak features. We see warm front after warm front building more and more mild air across the country. And so at the moment, at this time of year, we'd normally expect an average of about 7 or 8 Celsius in the south, 5 or 6 further north. But here's how the temperatures are looking over the next few days. We pick somewhere in the south, let's say Southampton, and you can see that temperature trend, 10, 11 Celsius up to about 12 or 13 on Thursday and Friday. And then a dip into the start of next week. More on that in just a moment. Similarly for Hull, up into the double figures by later this week and into the weekend. So relatively mild air, a few degrees above average. Newcastle, likewise, this temperature trend. This is the maximum temperature, the daytime temperature. This is the minimum, the overnight temperature. So we're looking at frost-free conditions as we go into the weekend. Double figures by day, 8 or 9 by night. But further north as well. We're looking at 6 degrees today and then up into the double figures by the end of the week. Aberdeen could actually be higher than this, given that the winds will be coming in from the west, get a bit of Föhn effect where the wind dries out and warms up over the higher ground, leading to double figures, 12, 13 Celsius or so, and frost-free later this week. But then a cold front, perhaps introducing some cold air, as I mentioned, on Saturday and into Sunday. So that cold front, as it spreads south across the UK, certainly looks like it's going to bring a colder feel to things on Saturday into Sunday across Scotland. And taking a look at the broader trends in temperature over the next few days. Now, this is Glasgow, so it's generally representative of the trend for Scotland. And this thing here, it says temperature 850 hectopascals. It's basically a proxy for the temperature, how warm or cold it will be. The higher up here it is, the warmer it is. And you can see each of these dotted lines is a different computer model run. So this is good for looking at trends, but also the range of possibilities and the uncertainties and so on. It goes out to the end of next week. And this shows this warming up trend later this week and into the start of the weekend. Then it drops away. Whoops. then it drops away later Saturday into Sunday. Not all model runs, but most of them drop away, and then back up to mild conditions for the start of next week before a gradual trend towards cooler conditions or colder conditions later next week. Another place that is interesting to look at further south, Reading, fairly typical of southern parts of the UK, and we haven't necessarily got that dip, or not a significant one like Glasgow through the weekend. There's an upwards trend later this week and then a slight downwards trend beyond that. A similar graphic here, again all the dotted lines show different computer model runs, and this is basically a proxy for the pressure at the surface, so how high or low the pressure is. And through the next few days, rising pressure as that high pressure develops more widely, and then a general trend downwards into the second half of next week, but only back to around what we've got at the moment. So still relatively high pressure throughout, although it gets a bit bigger in terms of the range of possibilities. That's for Reading, but for Glasgow as well, there's this increased pressure trend into the weekend and then slowly tailing off through next week. So what does that mean for our weather? Basically, that means that we're looking at most likely higher pressure through the next few days. We're keeping that north-south contrast, but the north at least will become a bit less wet and windy compared with the next couple of days by the time we get to the weekend, as higher pressure develops more widely. And these colours here represent different weather patterns in charge of the UK's weather and their probability out to the next couple of weeks, out to Valentine's Day. And what we can see here is this colour weather pattern is really dominant over the next few days, and that represents typically high pressure centred weather patterns, so higher pressure over the UK. And that's the kind of weather pattern that is pretty likely out to the start of next week. Then we get some of these other reds increasing their likelihood, and they represent different orientations of the area of high pressure, whether it's a bit more to the north or to the east and so on. But really, it's later next week that the likelihood of the high pressure centred drops below 50%. So it's the most likely weather pattern towards the middle of next week. And then what looks likely is one of two things: the high pressure slightly adjusts its position, so it's in a slightly different state, or these blues become a bit more likely, and that represents more changeable weather coming from the Atlantic. Low pressure a bit more likely. So a lot of uncertainty actually later next week and into the following weekend. You can see by all the different colours here the likelihood of all these different kinds of weather patterns. Very mixed signals basically coming from the full range of computer model output. But that is still a long way off, and there'll be much more on that in tomorrow's 10-day trend, Wednesday's 10-day trend. And so, yeah, as I said at the beginning, if you're not subscribed already to the Met Office YouTube channel to enjoy more of these deep dives or the weekly 10-day trend and so on, please do hit the subscribe button, and we'll be here on a regular basis, deep diving into the weather and explaining a little bit more than you'd get in a normal forecast. Bye-bye.